Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey to the age of the Shogun, to walk in the footsteps of the samurai, to feel the weight of the katana at our side, the silence of a dimly lit dojo, and the ever-present pull of duty to one's lord. We often imagine samurai as noble warriors living by honor alone, yet their lives were shaped by strict codes, shifting loyalties, and the quiet burdens of service. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what other period of history you would like to experience. Now, steady your spirit, for the path of the samurai awaits. Chapter 1. Dawn above the garden. You woke before sunrise, bowed toward the alcove, and set your mind in order as you smoothed the tatami. While the dry straw scent steadied your breath, you let the futon lie folded at your knees and kept your hands still for a count that you had learned as a boy. You had placed a simple scroll in the alcove the week before, and you kept your head lowered toward the brushed characters without reading them. Your body had woken the same way for years, not with hurry, but with small tasks that led one to the next. You flattened the sleeping mat again with the heel of your hand and lifted each corner so the edges lay even. You tucked the cushion back into its place and set the writing box parallel to the shelf. You checked the tsuba to be sure it had not shifted in the night, and you saw the stand hold the long blade where you had left it. You bowed again toward the alcove and stood with care, so the floor remained still. The shape of the morning settled like a pattern on cloth, every fold aligned with the next. You breathed out once and let the thought of duty return as a simple, clear idea. In the small room beside the garden, at the hour called Tiger, you began the day as the house expected. The temple bell sounded once beyond the quarter, and then fell silent again. You placed your folded bedding into the chest, and slid the lid in place, so the plank met the groove without force. You arranged your sandals near the threshold, and set your travel jacket on the peg where it always hung. You lifted the shoji a hand's width and paused, not to look, but to count the breath that made the body straight from the waist. You kept the hibachi banked and left the charcoal as the steward preferred during dry days. You checked the bucket by the step, knowing the well rope would need oil before the month turned. You kept your mind on the order of the room and the order of the hours ahead. You did not ask for a sign from the morning, because the list of duties was already written in your habits. You turned once more to the alcove and held a calm thought of the house and the clan. You dressed in the quiet way you had been taught, beginning with the kosode and then settling into the hakama that reached the ankles. You drew the jacket over your shoulders and shook the sleeves once to make the fold lie flat. You laid the wakizashi by the stand while you wrapped the obi, and the knot took its place at your side. The rough weave of the obi rested under your fingers as you tightened it in the familiar cross. You wound the seijo and tied it so the cord would hang with the right weight. You smoothed your hair and fixed the top knot with the simple pin that had served you for years. You checked the fittings on the long blade by sight and by habit, and left the sword on the stand until it would be time to step out. You placed the purse in your sleeve, not heavy, but enough for ink and repairs if they came due. You took the small cloth packet where you kept a needle and a bit of spare twine for straps. You drew yourself upright once more, and let posture take the place of any other thought. You walked the path of small tasks in the same order as always, and the room answered by growing ready for the day. You set a pinch of tea in the cup and let the water stand so it would not be harsh on the leaves. The warmth of the cup moved into your hands as you sat and counted the first sips. You ate a bowl of rice left from the evening and a strip of pickled daikon that kept well in any season. You touched the mat with both palms to mark thanks for the food and the work that filled it. You lifted the broom from the peg and worked the bristles along the boards of the veranda from the inner corner to the outer step. You paused by the water jar and moved the lid so rain would not find a place to gather on the rim. You looked at the garden stones and saw that nothing had been disturbed by cats or wind in the night. You straightened the wooden ladle by the basin and set the cloth ready for hands that would come and go. You folded the tea cloth and laid it square on the shelf, and the room once again held its proper shape. You thought of these acts as small, but they held the house together in ways you did not remark at first. You had learned that order did not rise from feeling but from practice that returned each morning. You had seen older men steady themselves in the same ways and keep their temper by keeping their rooms. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered. The scroll in the alcove spoke of restraint, and each crease you set in fabric answered to that line without a word. The house code asked for obedience, and you found it easier to obey when everything had its place. The clan expected clear writing and steady hands, and that steadiness began with the first bow and the first sweep. You remembered that you were not alone in this, even when the room stood quiet and the garden waited without opinion. You had a day before you that would ask for muscle and for care, and these quiet beginnings made a kind of promise to both. You knew the next hours would bring training in the courtyard and the company of a friend who held the same lessons in his bones. You slid the door and stepped into the corridor that led toward the yard, and you kept your pace easy so the morning would not break open all at once. You set your thoughts on the shapes of cuts and the calm that came when movement matched breath. You would meet Kenji before the hour changed, and he would nod in the same simple way that always made talk unnecessary at the start. You knew he would bring his wooden sword, and a grin that showed he had slept well enough to find the line of practice again. You would greet the gatekeeper and offer a word for the garden before you both took your place on the packed ground. You had a ledger to sign later, and a steward to face with numbers that measured rice and duty, but first your shoulders would loosen in the rhythm of work. You had a helmet to oil by noon and a report to draft by evening, and the day would hold together if the morning began without waste. You lifted your wooden sword from its place and let the thought of contest fall away so form would lead. The smooth grain of the bokken lay along your palm and reminded you of seasons that had marked the same grip. You moved toward the courtyard with an easy spine, and the dawn opened its hour for the lesson that waited. Chapter 2. Practice in the courtyard. You slid the shoji aside and stepped from the ordered room into the corridor. The floorboards carried the marks of many seasons, and you placed your feet with care. You tied the cords of your hakama and settled the belt so the knot sat flat. From the stand by the door, you lifted the bokken that you kept sanded and straight. Kenji waited near the threshold with his own practice sword held at his side. You shared a small bow and let your earlier thoughts from the alcove fall away. The house still held the calm of early duty, and that suited the start of practice. You felt the breath settle as you turned toward the yard that lay beyond the eaves. The path carried you past the storehouse and along the edge of the outer hall. The cool air touched your face as you stepped out to the open ground. In the inner courtyard within the low wall, the ground waited, marked by many pairs of feet. The racks for staves and wooden blades stood along the porch with a bucket and ladle near the well. You and Kenji took your places at the line brushed into the earth by the instructor. You sank to Caesar, bowed to the rack, and stood with the spine straight. Your hands found the same grip they had found the day before, and many days before that. You lifted the bokken to Chudan, turned your hips, and let the shoulders rest low. Together you began the first set of saburi, counting the cuts by breath and duty. The knock of wood kept time as the forms unfolded in their familiar order. Kenji watched your shoulders, and you watched his feet, so each of you learned without words. Routine carried you along the first rows of cuts until the body followed the pattern by itself. The instructor came from the porch and stood with hands behind his back while you finished the third set. He did not need to speak, and you did not look to him, because the order of the morning was known. Kenji shifted to your left so that you could pass into the next stance without crowding the line. You raised to Joden, stepped forward, and let the cut fall through the center as he received and returned. The instructor gestured to your forearm once and moved on, reminding you to ease the elbow and keep the wrists alive. You breathed once, reset the feet, and began again with the same measured pace. The grain of the wood pressed steady under your palm as the repetition made a simple promise. In the corner, the steward's assistant crossed the yard with papers for the main house and paused to watch. You saw the day's path form in your mind from practice to ledger and then to tasks along the wall. Kenji looked toward the gate and then back to you, and both of you kept to the count that was yours to keep. When the instructor lifted his hand, you and Kenji shifted to paired practice and set distance with 2 slow steps. You raised the bokken, he raised his, and the first exchange began with a plain block and return. You stepped, cut, recovered to guard, and held while he moved around the outside line. Then you circled, tested the space with the wooden tip, and settled the timing without haste. You entered on a small opening, met his blade, and followed with the rhythm you had been taught. Your feet slid in suriashi, so the hips did not rise, and the knees kept their patience. The grit of sand under your tabi marked each clean stop at the end of a line. You both paused, checked distance again, and repeated the pattern until the sequence felt plain and useful. The instructor moved between pairs, nudged a wrist here, eased a stance there, and left you to do the work. Your shoulders stayed steady, and the simple chain of actions held you to the morning's duty. When the sets were over, you and Kenji bowed to each other and to the rack, and you eased the knots of your hakama. You wiped the bokken with a cloth, checked the edge for chips, and returned it to its place on the stand. Kenji spoke of a message from the guard post by the north gate, and you answered with a plan for the next drill. You both kept your words plain and short because the day had more tasks than talk. The morning practice had loosened what the night had held tight, and it joined the many days that built your steadiness. You drank a cup of barley tea from a small flask, and the bitter taste reminded you to keep your attention simple. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered, because the small cuts and the small steps held the mind like a good knot. The instructor nodded once to the yard and left toward the offices, and the assistant gathered the papers that had been delivered. You and Kenji agreed to meet again at the noon hour if duty allowed, and each of you turned to the next piece of work. Your next step led toward the steward, whose ledgers waited for careful hands and clear patience. You walked back under the eaves and followed the corridor that connected the yard to the wing where the steward kept his room. Kenji went toward the sheds to check on spear shafts for later drill, and he raised a hand as he turned away. You adjusted your obi so the knot sat firm and straight, and you smoothed the front of your kimono. The steps of duty were many and plain, and practice had set your pace for each one. You passed a servant carrying a tray and a clerk rolling a map, and both made space as you went by. The soft creak of the gate hinge met you as you entered the inner court that led to the records room. You thought of the strokes you would make on the paper, and you felt ready to match them to the measures that ruled the storehouses. The morning had begun with breath and balance, and it would continue with ink and numbers shaped by steady patience. You paused once at the threshold to straighten your shoulders, and then you stepped forward without hurry. The day turned toward counting the harvest, and the calm of the yard followed you into the steward's hall. Chapter 3: Counting the Harvest. You left the courtyard with your shoulders cooled from practice, and your breath even again. Kenji set the bokken back on the rack and bowed with you. Then he turned toward the armory to put away the gear. You retied the cords of your hakama and settled the daisho at your hip so the hilts sat as they should. The steward had sent word the night before, so you walked toward the record hall at the back of the granary where the books were kept. Kenji walked beside you for a time and spoke of how his bowstring had held through the drills, then said he would wait by the porch. You passed under the gate of the inner yard where the plaster walls kept their plain turn, and the watchman nodded from his mat. The soft scuff of your sandals against the stone path kept a steady measure that matched your step. Duty with ink and numbers did not stir the blood, yet you had learned it steadied the house as surely as a spear steadied a line. The morning still held before the mess call, and that time was enough for the tally. You approached the low eaves of the office and placed your palm to your thigh before you slid the door. It was still early when you entered the ledger room beside the main storehouse, a place used each fifth day for stipends and village accounts. The room had a low writing table along the wall, a chest for seals, and shelves with bundles tied in hemp cord. The steward sat in his usual spot with his back straight and a simple crest on his sleeve, and the clerk waited with a brush lifted from its rest. Two headmen from the hills sat by the far wall, and a porter with a tally stick sat near the doorway. The faint odor of rice husk dust lingered from the storehouse next door and marked the kind of work done here. You bowed until your hands touched the mats and stayed until the steward returned the courtesy. You gave your unit tablet with its mark cut into the wood, and the clerk placed it at the corner of the table. Kenji remained by the porch with his knees folded and his cap set beside him, content to wait while you dealt with the record. The steward asked for the training roster and the last issue of Arrows, and you answered in order. Then he opened the ledger and pointed to the line where your stipend was kept. The numbers for the year had been divided among coin, rice, and small allowances, and the steward spoke in a slow voice while the clerk traced the lines. You listened and measured each figure against the duty chart you had learned as a boy, checking the rate for a man of your rank. He reminded you of the portions set aside for the Lord's procession, for guards at the ferry, and for the shrine offering at the month's end. The steward slid a soroban closer and moved a row with 2 fingers as he recounted the allotment. The gentle click of the beads carried across the table as he brought them against the bar to make the sum plain. You asked about the arrears from the last flood year and whether the village of the lower fields had made up the shortage. The clerk answered that terms had been given and that the spring levy had kept the chest sound enough for stipends. Your own amount on the page matched the figure you had in your head, and you nodded to show agreement. Kenji leaned in from the porch to confirm the number for shared rations during border patrol weeks, then withdrew so as not to clutter the floor. The steward brought out a small box for seals and set it by your hand, waiting for your mark. You unwrapped your small inkstone and stick and asked the clerk for a saucer of water, then set the paper ready for the receipt. The formal words came first, naming the year by the era and the season by its proper moon, and then the lines for measure and duty. You wrote slowly, so the characters held their shape and gave the figures room, because a hurried hand bred needless trouble. The scratch of the brush across the paper kept your patience in order and steadied your breath as you filled the strokes. When you finished the receipt, you took your seal from its case and pressed it in the mark of cinnabar, then set it firm beside your name mark. The steward counted out the rice issue as a note rather than a bail, and he passed you a tally tag for the storehouse keeper to honor. You accepted the tag and repeated the steward's words so the clerk could write the acknowledgement without error. A porter brought in a sample weight, and the clerk recorded it against the season's rate, a small check that made the rest proceed cleanly. You returned the inkstone to its cloth and dried the nib with a square of paper, and the clerk sanded the page and turned it to face the steward. The steward lifted the ledger, read through the lines once more, and made his mark to show the account stood in good order. With the lines confirmed and the tag tucked at your waist, you felt the ease that came from clear accounts, the kind that left no corners to catch a boot. The steward poured barley tea and spoke of the small needs that a stipend touched, like oil for the lacing on a kabuto or hemp for a new bowstring. The warmth of the cup sat in your hands while you listened and weighed how much to send to the Fletcher and how much to keep for the next levy. You thought of Kenji's quiver and of the Ashigaru under your watch who would take their rice from the storehouse in due time. The clerk reminded you that a portion would be taken in coin for the inn on the Lord's Road, since travel days would return in their season. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered that numbers matched, for the line held its shape when bellies were fed and shoes were mended. You asked after the paper for training expenses, and the steward said the captain would sign it after the afternoon signal. There had been some talk of a march to the border stations for a day of standing in files, and the steward said you would be told by the drum. Kenji thanked the steward for the tea and rose to fetch your tag to the keeper, and you stood so you could bow the proper way at the threshold. The elder headman from the hills saluted with his 2 fingers and promised his share at the next moon, and the clerk made a note in the book. You left the room with the ledger closed behind you and walked along the corridor with Kenji toward the yard where the storehouse doors faced the open ground. He asked what the figure had been, and you told him, and he smiled in that small way that meant he also had found his count unchanged. He said the captain had asked for the unit to assemble after midday near the west gate. So you nodded and thought of the men and their gear. The sun lay warm on your sleeve as you crossed the stones, and you matched your step to the even shape of the yard. A porter came with a bale for another man and bowed as he passed, and you let him go without a word since his burden called for balance. You checked the tag again and slipped it deeper into your sash, then glanced toward the armory where the rack would need inspection. Kenji spoke of a small tear on a quiver strap and said he would mend it over the noon hour, and you said the needles were in the chest by the window. You both paused by the well and shared the ladle in turn, then set it back on its hook, and the moment stood quiet. The beat of the day moved along through small tasks and steady duty, all of it shaped by the page you had signed and the rice you would collect. You turned toward the mustering ground with your mind settled on order and distance, ready for the line work that waited beyond the gate. Chapter 4. Border Drill. Along the northern embankment, you left the steward's room and crossed the yard with your ledger closed and your mind turned to the march. Kenji waited by the armory door with his sash tied and nodded when you reached him. You returned the ledger to the clerk, set down your brush roll, and took up the yari from the rack. The captain signaled for muster, and you moved to your place in the second file with Kenji 1 pace to your left. You checked the knots on your sleeves and the tie at your breast, then eased the blade cap onto the spear point. The sergeant counted numbers down the row and made sure the intervals were even. You rolled your shoulders once to settle the layers of cloth and plate and set your thought on the work. Kenji adjusted the cord at his cuff and touched the end of his spear to the ground in a small, careful motion. You lifted the butt of your spear and held it close as the standard bearer stepped into place. The smooth shaft lay cool against your palm, and you were ready to follow the line. By late morning, you stood with the unit along the northern embankment where the paddies gave way to scrub and a hillside. The captain raised his baton and set the pace with short motions that set the measure. You kept your place on the right of Kenji and took the banner as your cue for each pause and start. At the signal, you angled your spear toward the slope and stepped forward with the line as taught. The order to hold came soon after, and you drew back and settled your feet to the measure given. On the next signal, you pushed forward again, carried the point level, and kept the ranks straight. You remembered the steward's tally and thought of the rice that made this drill possible and gave it meaning. The unit edged up to the marker stakes, then slid back 3 paces to the base of the bank. The steersman of the line checked the spacing and made a sign for a small adjustment, and you matched the change. The thud of feet against packed earth kept your timing as you moved and settled back into place. The sergeant had arranged men of different ages along the files so each could learn from the other without talk. You noted how the Ashigaru carried shorter spears, and how the men in armor guarded the flanks in a steady way. Your sleeves, cords, and plates worked with your hakama so you could move and set your weight without waste. Kenji watched the line with care and kept his point even with yours, neither eager nor slow in any motion. The standard bearer stood back a pace and held the banner upright so the captain could judge if the line drifted. Water gourds hung at a post for when the break came, and each man had a rice ball and a small plum wrapped in paper for the noon pause. You inspected the shaft for splinters and checked the cap lashing so the point would cast true when ordered. The steward's book would show who stood the border this day, and the clerk would note any correction the officers required. You kept your count even, and fixed your attention on the slope where the markers stood. The weight of the yari lay sure in your hands and reminded you to keep the distance that made the line strong. The captain raised his baton, the sergeant gave the order to advance 2 paces, and you moved with the line. On the direction to level, you set the spear flat with your shoulder and kept the point on the stake that marked the far ground. At the signal to thrust, you slid the front hand, let the rear hand drive, and sent the point to the mark. On the command to recover, you drew the shaft back, checked the feet, and set the rear elbow near the body for the next change. When told to hold, you stood planted with the butt set near your heel while the captain walked the front. The second sequence added a half turn to guard the side, and you pivoted on the ball of the foot and brought the spear around without crossing your neighbor. At the instruction to brace, you angled the butt for a rush, bent the front knee, and left the point steady where the captain expected it. When the order to close came, the line stepped in as one, and you kept the distance you had counted so the rank stayed even. The officers repeated the series until the rhythm settled, and your hands moved in the order without thought or hurry. The grain of the haft pressed into your palm during each drive, and reminded you to keep the line firm. When the captain paused the drill, you took stock of the line and of your own steadiness without pride. The border practice did not show itself as daring or bright, yet it bound men to the same pace and the same duty. It made the rice secure because men learned where to stand and how to stop a rush without breaking step. You thought of the tally in the steward's room and how each stroke on the paper depended on order in fields and roads. Kenji glanced at you once and then back to the files, and you both knew that no one would notice a smooth drill, yet it kept trouble small. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered. The captain marked 2 errors with calm instruction, and the sergeant set the correction to be tried again after the short rest. You shifted the spear to your other side and rolled your ankles to keep the joints easy for the next round. A mild tremor in your calves remained from the stepping and reminded you to measure the ground with care. You felt the day moving toward noon and understood that after dismissal, you would tend to gear and notes before the noon mark. When the final dismissal came, you and Kenji returned the line to the yard and walked the spears back to the rack in order. You logged the drill with the clerk in a brief note and saw the captain's mark on the edge of the sheet that would go to the officer of the day. Kenji spoke of the next rotation on the riverbank, and you made a plain answer and left the rest of the talk for later. You loosened the helmet ties and eased the cords across your shoulders so the weight would sit well while you crossed the paving. The sergeant nodded once to you both and turned to the next group that would practice the same steps in the afternoon. You looked at your kabuto and the small dents that showed years of use and thought about the care it deserved before the next watch. The bench under the eaves waited for you, the cloth, the oil, and the patience that would follow the drill. Kenji set his spear in the corner and said he would return after he checked on a message that had come for him from his uncle. The shade under the eaves cooled your neck as you sat and laid out the fittings one by one for the work that always steadied your hands. You set your mind to the careful work and let the morning pass toward noon. Chapter 5. Quiet Repairs. Beneath the north eaves. After the line folded back into the yard and the captain dismissed the ranks, you stepped to the eaves and set your bundle down. You loosened the knot at your chin and lifted the kabuto with care, feeling the order of the drill still moving through your breath. You spread your folded cloth upon the plank and placed the helmet crown up so the plates rested easy. You unrolled a small kit you had kept from your father, with a bottle of oil plugged with a sliver of wood and a square of old leather. You counted the ties before you moved them, because habit, once set, kept later worry away. You checked the cords where they ran through the holes of the shikoro, noting any fray at the edges and any spot where the weave had thinned. You dampened the cloth faintly with oil and began to move in regular circles, small and patient, circling the ridge and the visor. After the formation dispersed, you sat under the eaves and cleaned your kabuto, moving the cloth with slow circles, while the faint smell of oil softened the noon air. You worked over the crest holder and the rivets, careful not to catch the cloth on any metal edge that might tear thread. You did not hurry, because a hurried hand only returned later to fix what it had missed. It was midday at the barracks' north eaves, where the planks were sound and the overhang kept the light off the armor stands. The captain had gone to report to the steward about the morning's march, and the unit drifted to small tasks like leaves settling after wind. The armorer's boy carried a tray of pegs and small tools down the passage, and the quartermaster checked lists with a short brush he kept tucked in his belt. You set a low stool and placed the kabuto between your knees, with the cloth and the bottle just at hand so your reach would be easy. You laid out a sack of rice bran for later, and a length of cord stiffened at the tip with wax to help with any lacing that needed threading. The menpo rested beside the helmet, its strap coiled so it would not twist the next time you took it up. You remembered the way your teacher had said to keep the order of things clear, so that the mind would be clear when orders came. The shade lay cool on your neck as you leaned in to study the Teihan fittings at the crown. You noted where the lacquer had held, and where it showed the story of carried years in small chips. You nodded to the guard at the gate as he passed, and he nodded back, each of you keeping to the day's plain work. Kenji came from the yard with a needle bound to a bit of thread and a pinch of beeswax pinched in paper, and he set them near your knee without fuss. He said the steward had been satisfied with the koku reckoning, and that the scribe in the storehouse had already posted the tally on the board. You thanked him and lifted the kabuto to catch the line of the visor, checking the hinge where the mabizashi met the bowl. You worked the cloth into the seam and turned it so the plates of the shikoro would each see a pass of the circles. You pointed to a frayed place in the odoshi near the ear and said it would do for a little longer, and Kenji agreed, then slid his knife along the wax to prepare a tip in case. You tidied the shinobi no-o cord, rolling it back and forth so the twist lay true when next tied. You held the helmet so the light found the curve, and a dull gleam drew a thin line along the lacquered plate. Kenji asked if the armorer could spare a few brass washers, and you said the armorsmith kept them under the bench in a jar. He nodded and went to ask, leaving you to follow the circle of the cloth, one small part at a time, plain as breath. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered. You moved from the kabuto to the menpo and checked the toggle that held it to the helmet, making sure the knot would release and fasten without catching. You examined the rivets and pressed each with your thumb to feel if any had loosened their seat, then tapped one lightly with the smallest hammer from the kit. You took up a narrow strip of leather and rubbed it along the edge of the visor to lift any soil before it could settle, then followed with a thin coat of oil laid on neat. You threaded the stiffened tip of cord through a stubborn hole at the shikoro edge and eased the run so the plates lay without strain. You set a small patch on a nicked place in the lacing, wrapping twice and tying off with a square knot that would sit flat under the plate. You unfolded the longer cloth and wiped the dew where it had rested against the harness, then rolled the sleeves of your kote to inspect the seams by the wrist. You drew your small whetstone and gave your tanto a few steady passes to keep a clear edge in case the heavier tools were needed later. The soft scrape of the stone moved like a metronome across the short blade while you kept your hand even. You turned the yari head and checked the socket, running a cloth through to catch dust. and then you greased the shaft end where it met the metal. You finished the pass along the shikoro and set the kabuto down, satisfied that each part could serve without complaint. You looked over the work and saw only the quiet of mind that followed a simple task done in order, and you let the stillness settle. You had learned that iron, cord, and lacquer asked for time, and that time given now spared time later when strain could be harder. You thought of your father showing you how to wrap a knot so it would release under load, and how the knot had seemed small then, yet it held more than it showed. It protected the head under the bowl, it kept the plates aligned, it saved fuss in a wind, and it meant the captain could trust you would stand ready when asked. You remembered the steward's board with its neat strokes, and you understood that gear and grain shared the same rule, which was steady care. You saw the unit moving about the yard in the same rhythm, each man carrying out tasks that looked plain from a distance, yet added up to a firm line. You lifted the helmet once more, and the weight sat steady in your palms as if answering the measure of the day. You set it down within easy reach, and wound the cord in a small circle that would not cut or kink by morning. You thought briefly of the river posts and the stake targets there, and you knew this care would follow you if you were called to stand. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered. You gathered the cloths, sealed the bottle with its wooden plug, and folded the kit as you had unfolded it, so the order remained clear. You slid the kabuto into its cover and stored it on the stand so the plates would not press against anything that could bend them. You checked your quiver and counted the arrows, setting aside 2 for repair and laying a spare bowstring in its pouch ready to change without delay. You noted the place of your sandals by the door and set your ledger with a piece of paper at the next blank line where the evening note would go. You watched Kenji return the borrowed washers to the armorer and share a few words with the gate guard, and you felt the simple tie of shared labor. You thought of the shrine path and the habit of washing the hands at dusk, and you found ease in planning the small steps the evening would hold. You breathed in and let your shoulders rest, knowing the day had moved from drill to care and would move again to quiet food and ink. A single cicada rasped beyond the wall and marked the hour without any strain. You glanced once more at the orderly row of gear and felt the plain comfort of readiness earned by patience. You left the helmet ready in case the horn reached the yard again, and you sat with easy back beneath the eaves as the day turned toward its next duty. Chapter 6. Taking post at the river bend. You had just set the kabuto in your lap and turned the cloth once more when the horn sounded from the gate. The call came low and even, the kind of sound that pulled loose thoughts into a single line. You placed the kabuto beside you on the mat and stood, the cloth folded into the sleeve. Kenji stepped from the shade with his sleeves tied back and gave a small nod that matched your own. The sergeant passed at a brisk walk and pointed with 2 fingers toward the river path. You lifted the yumi from its rack and checked the bowstring with a measured touch, then slipped the yugake over your right hand. You settled the helmet cords across your shoulders without tightening them, knowing the bank wind might be light today. The quiver sat ready near the doorway, and you counted the practice arrows, noting the fletching and blunt heads. You followed the yard out, sandals clean enough, pace matched to Kenji's steady stride. It may not have seemed important then, but you knew the errands of the body would now serve the errands of the post. You kept your breath even as you crossed the draining line where the eaves ended. By early afternoon, you reached the bend where the river narrowed beside the old willow stand. The water made a slow lap against the stones, even enough to mark a count. The captain stood with his fan folded, and his words clipped to the size of the moment. A youth from the storehouse brought bundles of stake targets and lengths of rope over his shoulder. The carpenter and the fisher set the stakes into the shallows while the steersman held a skiff against the current. You and Kenji took your posts 2 lengths apart, each with the bank line marked by a looped cord. The scout set flags upriver to mark a drift line, and another placed a pole where the target run would end. The quartermaster passed along extra strings and a small tin of wax, his routine as plain as sweeping a floor. You flexed your fingers inside the glove and set your feet to the earth the way your teacher had taught you in winter. The field cook stood back with a ladle tucked in his sash, watching as if counting the pauses. You let the bow rest upright beside you, taller than your shoulder, and waited for the sign. Kenji rubbed his forearm where the brace would sit and lifted his chin toward the flags. The quartermaster opened a plain box and showed the heads, each one carved from wood and ringed to prevent splintering. He spoke of how real iron would be issued only on confirmed sighting, and you nodded without comment. You turned an arrow in your hand and recognized the Fletcher's mark burned into the shaft near the nock. The wax felt faintly sticky along the string as you ran it once and set the tin away. You pulled the sleeve cords tight above the elbow and tied your hair, simple knots from habit. Kenji lifted his quiver, counted under his breath, and squared his shoulders to the bank. The captain reminded you all that duty was a path with steps, not leaps, and that a steady line was worth more than a single quick shot. The elder from the village stood near the flags to watch, hands joined behind his back. The stakes went in straight and true, bound with rope and leveled to the surface, so they would ride as a raft train. You checked the brace height, looked once at the willow, then closed that thought and stood ready. It may not have seemed important then, but small measures taken without hurry saved trouble later. The sergeant lifted his baton and set the order to knock on his count. On the first count, you set the arrow to the string and lifted the bow, arms spread as you had been taught. On the second count, you drew in a single firm motion until the knock sat into the glove and your shoulder settled. The captain's fan opened like a small gate, and you let the body line hold. You released, and the twang of the string marked the moment as the shaft left you. You shifted the left hand down, recovered your stance, and stepped back one pace to clear the line. The stake targets slid across the current, and the sergeant called for another shot at the second flag. You knocked again, lifted, drew and loosed, then lowered and held until the man to your right finished. The unit kept the rhythm, orders simple and steady, and you matched the rise and fall as if repeating a poem learned in youth. Kenji's arrow struck the stake and held, and he reset his feet without looking for approval. You held on the last count, arrow at rest, and waited for the captain to call recover, then returned to the ready. The exercise repeated across the drift line, and your hands worked without rush now that the pattern sat in them. You knew that a shot was not a leap, but a sequence, and each part answered the one before. When the captain closed his fan and lowered his hand, you stood at rest with the bow along your leg and the string slack. You looked once at the stake line and understood how the current and a simple rope could serve both trade and trouble. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered that your hands moved in order without wanting praise. The elder spoke to the captain about the ferry upstream and the grain barges that would pass after the rains. Kanji glanced at you with the trace of a smile that said the lesson had settled without noise. You slipped an arrow from the string and checked the nock for wear, counting how many would need new wrapping before the next muster. The cool grit along your thumb from the string reminded you where the glove pressed and where you should ease the draw. The sergeant spoke of posting a rotating watch at the bend, 2 by day, 2 by night, and you marked the days in your head. The quartermaster collected the extra strings and stowed the wax, and the youth gathered the spare stakes. You and Kenji straightened the loops along the bank line and walked the flags back to the storeroom together. This was a small task, but the river held the road to the Lord's storehouses, and steady hands kept that road clear. You felt the body ease as the release order passed down the line, and the unit turned toward the path. You walked back at an easy pace, bow held so the tips would not catch the low branches by the path. The reeds along the bank made a small hush as the breeze went over them, and the village children stepped aside to watch. Kenji spoke once about rewrapping his grip and then kept quiet, and you matched that quiet without effort. The captain dismissed the line at the yard, and men broke away to stow gear, to sweep, and to check knots that would matter on another day. You unstrung the bow, coiled the string, and set the arrows in their slot, then smoothed the edge of the quiver lid. The steward's clerk passed with a ledger tucked under his arm, and you knew the marks for the alarm would be set against the day's record. You thought of the willow bend, and the plain rhythm that had carried you from knock to hold and back again. It may not have seemed urgent, but the habit of calm work kept your mind from drifting toward stories of fame. Kenji lifted his palm toward the hill path, and you knew he meant to climb toward the shrine after the gear was put away. You bowed once to the rack, a small courtesy to the tools that bore your duty without complaint. The yard settled and the talk fell low, and you let the shoulders loosen as the chores of evening drew near. You felt the day tilt toward its softer hour, and your steps turned toward the gate where the path to the Toria began. Chapter 7. Shrine Path at Dusk. You left the bank when the horn was silent and lowered the Yumi into its cover. The unit dispersed in orderly pairs, and you and Kenji walked the road that climbed toward the old shrine. Your steps found a steadier pace once the marsh lay behind you. You did not speak much, and Kenji kept by your side with the easy manner you knew from training. The gates waited above the village field, and the ridge path curved toward them. You felt the day untie itself from your shoulders as the duty post grew smaller behind you. At the torii, you inclined your head and passed through with plain respect. The stone basin stood ahead under a small roof, and you lifted a ladle and rinsed your left hand, then your right, then your mouth. You let the last drops fall to the ground as you had been taught. The cool water eased the strain from your wrists. It was dusk at the hill shrine, and the gravel yard lay neatly between the hall and the small storehouse. The path rose in short steps toward the main doors. You and Kenji paused beneath the eaves and let the body settle after the drill. The steward of the place nodded from a side porch and went on with his notes. A young acolyte carried a broom across the yard in steady sweeps. A pair of farmers finished their bows and stepped aside without hurry. The small fox guardians watched from their stones with old patience. You moved along the flagstones toward the offertory rail. A row of lanterns along the path gave a gentle glow. It felt right to match your step to that calm measure. You kept the day close and quiet as you chose a place to stand. You had come with plain clothes over armor, the training jacket under a short coat, and the hakama tied without show. The sword cord sat where it should, and you shifted it, so the long blade lay easy at your hip. At the gate, a keeper sat by a rack for weapons, and you offered the long sword as courtesy for the prayer hour. The keeper wrote your mark on a slip and tucked it beneath the wrapping. The short sword remained with you at the belt, as was allowed. Kenji did the same with simple care that needed no words. You walked back to the rail and reached into the sleeve for a coin. Your hands still remembered rope and bowstring, yet they worked the small duty without rush. You slid the coin between your fingers so it would fall straight. The faint knock of the sayer against the rack stayed in your ear as a last note of duty. The small habit of manner steadied the mind more than any speech. You stepped forward when the space opened and gave a short bow before the box. You cast the coin and let it rest where it fell. You bowed again, then reached for the bell rope and drew it toward you. The rough hemp pressed your palm and told you where to hold. You pulled once, released, and let the pull mark the change of attention. You bowed twice, brought your hands together, and set the words in order inside without moving the lips. You asked for steadiness from yourself rather than favor, and set the names of those under you in the same still line. You brought your hands together twice, as was the way of this hall, then bowed once more. Kenji took his turn beside you with the same plain sequence. You both stepped aside and made room for the two farmers. You felt the shoulders sit lower as the order of the steps closed itself. You and Kenji walked the side path that led past the Ima rack and looked at the wishes tied there in careful hands. Some asked for good harvest, some for skill in craft, and some for safe birth in a quiet home. You did not read more than that, and you tied your own small prayer with a plain cord. At the fortune booth you drew a lot, read the middle blessing, and folded it to keep rather than bind to the branch. Kenji smiled at that, and said the words would serve so long as you kept your habits. You agreed and checked the knot at your sleeve to be sure the tag would not be lost. You looked across the yard, and saw the acolyte finish the sweeping, and carry the broom indoors. The crickets began along the grass at the edge of the steps. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered, for the shrine visit pulled the stray threads of the day into one braid. The walk, the bow, the coin, and the rope gave shape to things that might have drifted loose. You and Kenji stood there a moment longer, and understood there was no more to add. You turned for the road with Kenji, and the slope carried you down toward the guard quarter with an easy grade. The fields showed the last lines of workers going home, and a cart moved somewhere beyond the hedges. You spoke in low words about the steward's list for tomorrow and the need to mend a strap on the saddle. Kenji said he had thread and awl and would bring them to the bench by the lamp. You nodded and shifted the quiver so it rode well against the hip without rubbing. The smell of smoke from the barracks kitchen drifted along the lane and told you the cook had banked the fire for the evening meal. Your stomach answered in a mild way, and you let the thought of miso and rice take a place in the front of the mind. The day had held drill, repair, and watch, and the shrine had given it a lid that fit. You thanked Kenji for the company without ceremony. The two of you passed the last gate and stepped onto the yard. You felt the pace slow in a simple finish, and a calm space opened for what waited by the hearth. Chapter 8. Supper by the Hearth. You and Kenji walked back from the shrine path without hurry. letting the last of the duties fall away as you reached the gate. A sentry noted your return, and you gave the small nod that showed the hour was settled. You slid the door, stepped out of your sandals, and set your swords in the rack with the care that the day always asked. The cook looked up from the hearth and tipped a ladle toward 2 waiting bowls, and you bowed as you moved to kneel. Kenji sank to the mat across from you, his shoulders easy now that the alarm had passed. A few men from the next room joined the circle, and the veteran took his usual place by the beam. You spoke the thanks you had learned as a child, and waited until the cook nodded. Around the hearth, the low talk moved like a stream, steady and unforced among those who shared the same work. You did not add much, and that was fine, because the day had already said what it needed in its quiet measures. The first mouthful would wait for the signal from the steward, and in that pause you felt the house settle into its evening shape. It was early autumn in the long barracks by the inner palisade, and evening had settled in a way that made the room feel exact. The hearth sat near the center post, with the iron pot held by chain, and the rice kettle set to one side. You and Kenji reached for your bowls when the steward lifted his hand, and you bowed again before taking food. The cook had cut radish thin, and added a few leaves of greens from the yard, and the miso came from a well-kept barrel. A lacquer tray with pickles waited near the beam, and a small dish of salt rested beside it for those who needed it. 2 jars of water stood by the door, and a ladle lay across them to keep the measure fair. Your bowl sat steady in your hands, and the rising steam eased your hunger without hurry. Kenji lifted his lids and glanced once at the post as if marking the hour. You steadied your chopsticks with 3 fingers and set the tips on the rim until the elder at the far side took his share. The order of this small place matched the order of the yard, and for that you felt a simple respect. The steward measured rice by the scoop and kept a tally on a board, marking the line for each man with the same firm habit as in the storehouse. He spoke of next week's allotment of barley, and how the ships would be a day late if the river current held. The veteran told the cook to keep the last portion for the watchman, and no one argued, because the order of eating kept the order of work. You lifted the bowl and sipped, then set it down to take a piece of pickled plum, mindful of the seeds. Kenji said little, though he set his chopsticks aside once to flex his fingers, thinking of the bow he would check again before sleep. Across the room, the armor rack stood in its row, and the laces you had oiled at noon lay dry and ready on the low shelf. The cook's ladle moved in a calm circle, and the pot gave back enough for each man to feel that the Lord's store was sound. You took a thin slice of radish and felt the clean crunch as you bit, a small detail that put the body back in place. A junior, barely past his first year, watched the elder for the pace of the meal and copied it with care. You remembered a winter when the jar had run out too soon, and saw how routine guarded against such lean days. After the first bowls were emptied, the steward read the watch list, beginning with the far gate and working inward to the storehouse corner. Kenji drew the second watch at midnight, and you were set for dawn, which meant your writing would come before you slept. A messenger from the outer yard stepped in, knelt, and set a wrapped strip of paper by the beam, then withdrew without more than a nod. The elder at the far side glanced at it and said it would be opened after the meal, for haste at supper led to mistakes. You poured a second half ladle for Kenji and passed him the tray, and he returned it with the same measure. A junior upset his bowl, and the cook handed him a cloth and waited while the floor was wiped, keeping the line unbroken. The veteran reminded the young ones to check thong ties before sleep, and a few hands moved unconsciously to knots and cords at the hip. You took another small mouthful and felt the faint warmth from the brazier settle into your arms as the room quieted. The steward folded the list and tucked it into his sleeve, then pointed once to the wrapped paper for later reading. The last of the rice went to the watchman, and the circle loosened as each man found the pace that matched his night duty. When the bowls were set aside and the chopsticks wiped, you felt the day gather itself into a small, plain lesson. The drills on the hill had been orderly, the alarm at the river had been answered, and the meal now made a bridge back to ordinary hours. Kenji spoke once about the way the arrow nocks had seated, and you nodded, thinking of the cord that would need rewrapping before the month turned. The veteran said that a man was held together by small tasks more than great plans, and the cook, who had no rank, smiled as if he already knew. The steward lifted the wrapped strip at last, looked over its lines, and said only that the patrol routes would stay as written. You felt that this quiet verdict mattered more than a shout, because it let the floor stay steady under the simple duties of the house. A single lamp set near the post gave the room a soft light, and the younger men took it as the sign to clear trays and sweep. You stacked your bowl with care, set the lid on the pickle jar, and checked that the rice measure had been returned to its shelf. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered, because such care made your mind ready for the words that would follow. You and Kenji agreed you would meet again by the inner desk to go over the lines for the report, and he nodded, as if this had been settled all along. When the room thinned out, you rose with Kenji and carried your bowl to the washtub, then set it to dry with the others. Your swords went back into your sash, and you lifted the writing box from its place in the chest by the beam. Kenji drew the second watch strap from his belt to mend a thread, and you reminded him to rest before the hour called him. He smiled and said that he would meet you by the desk after a short nap, and then he went to fold his blanket near the far wall. You knelt by the low table, where reports were often written, and checked that the inkstone, brush, and paper were where you had left them in the morning. Your palm rested on the smooth lacquer of the box, and the cool surface steadied the way you shaped your next thoughts. The barracks had grown still as men found their sleeping places, and the space felt large enough for careful words. You looked once at the beam, as if measuring distance before a cut, and then let your breath slow to match the unforced pace of the night. The work ahead would be plain, to set the river alarm in lines, to note the measure of rice, and to close with thanks to the Lord. You gathered the tools and settled your knees under the table, content to begin the next part of the evening when the page lay ready. Chapter 9. Grinding the ink, setting down the day. After the last spoon scraped the bowl and the talk around the hearth thinned, you rose with Kenji and walked to the low table set aside for reports. You lifted the lacquered writing box and set it on the boards with care born of habit. Kenji took the corner seat and unfolded his tally slips for arrows and cords, keeping them near but out of your way. You opened your box and placed the inkstone so its shallow basin faced you. A splash from the gourd wet the hollow to the height you had learned as a youth. You set the sumi stick in your fingers and drew its edge over the stone in small circles. The cool grit under the stick set a steady rhythm that matched your breath. You watched the water darken, patient with the slow deepening that meant the ink held together. You laid out the sheets in a neat stack and set a wooden weight over the top. You centered the brush beside the stone and let your shoulders settle before the first line. It was late in the evening, in the small records corner beside the storehouse, where the day ended in neat bundles and knotted cords. The small oil lamp made a steady glow over the table. Earlier, the clerk had left a ledger open with a string marking the page, trusting you to copy the form. The steward had tied a cord around a packet of blank sheets and had marked it with his seal. You loosened the knot and smoothed the top sheet, feeling the day's work turn to words. The headings were plain and familiar, set by old rule, and left no room for flourish. You checked the date by the lunar count and added the hour just past dusk. You noted the post where you served, the river bend, and the northern embankment. You set aside a place for the steward's countersign and for the scribe's small note. You drew one long breath for steadiness and lifted the brush for the opening line. You began with a respectful greeting to the Lord, as was proper for any record that would pass beyond the gate. You wrote that the men had trained at morning with wooden swords and that shoulders had loosened in the yard. You noted the midday march at the embankment and the later alarm by the river that tested watchfulness. You set down the rice issued to the unit, counted in koku as the steward had confirmed. You added repairs to armor cords and the cloth for padding under helmets. You marked that 3 arrow shafts had split and were set aside for new fletching. You wrote that the Ashigaru would need straw sandals before the next week's patrol. Kenji kept his own tally of shafts and cords, tapping the figures in his slow, careful way. The brush made a single soft tick when it first touched the paper. You lifted and turned the bristles to keep the tip fine for the light strokes. You kept the lines even, allowing space for corrections if the steward wished them. You added a note about the barley sent from a tenant field to make up a small shortfall. When the first sheet filled, you dried the tip against the rim and set it down while your hand rested. You placed the second sheet and continued with the watch schedule for the next rotation. You wrote names by roll, listing the captain, the steersman, the gate guard, and the mess orderly. A dark bead gathered at the brush foot and left a small crescent on the margin where your paws had stretched. You folded a narrow hem to mark the floor and copied the line cleanly on a fresh sheet. You checked again the count of pikemen and archers, a line for each unit, leaving space for the steward's mark. You added a brief line about the ferry rope that had frayed and would need a splice before the next crossing. You stacked the finished sheets and pressed them under the wooden weight to keep them from curling. The paper grain was faint under your wrist as you ran a cord around the packet and drew it snug. You tied the knot in the usual way and set the packet on the tray so the steward would find it at first light. The work did not ask strength of the kind a field demands, yet it asked care that could not be rushed. You had done harder things in armor and mud, but this too was a part of service and steadied the house. The report would pass from the steward to the scribe, then to the lord, and from there decisions would travel back like a slow tide. It would send rice from storehouse to bowls and straw from field to sandals without quarrel. It set the measure of guard turns at the gate, and the count of arrows to be made by the fletcher. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered. You added a small slip to the packet, noting travel gear for the season's required procession. You wrote of poles for the palanquin, good cords for trunks, and spare wheel pins for the carts. You pictured the long line at dawn and the slow creak of a pack saddle as the string settled into pace. You placed the slip on top and smoothed the cord so the steward could read it without fuss. Around you the room returned to its plain order as Kenji gathered his slips and tied them with a twist of cord. You rinsed the brush, swirled a little water over the stone, and poured it out the window onto the packed earth. You wiped the sumi stick on a cloth and slid it back into its niche in the box. You closed the lid and set the box by the wall where it would wait without complaint. You lifted the packet to the shelf near the door so the steward could take it on his first walk through. You bowed toward the alcove and let your forehead rest against your joined hands. The tatami felt cool under your palms. You folded your bedding and placed it square on the floor, keeping the line of the edge straight. Kenji agreed on the hour to rise and stretched his legs without a word. You lay down with your mind on the coming road, steady in breath and ready for the banners to lift with the morning. Chapter 10. Procession to the Shogun's City. You laid the finished report on the low desk and blotted the last stroke, then set the sheet into its wrapper for the clerk. The seal sat clean, the cord was tied, and the lamp was pinched out with a practiced hand. You rolled the bedding, checked the cord on your travel pack, and placed your swords so you could reach them if the bell called before dawn. Kenji stepped to the threshold, nodded once, and told you the assembly order as he had heard it from the captain. You answered with a short word and gathered the small items that did not leave your side: the whetstone, the needle kit, and the pass with the Lord's seal. The yard outside waited before daybreak, and the ash pit marked the center where the men would form. You bound your leggings, set the travel straw hat to hand, and folded the rain cape into a tight roll. The steward's boy came down the row with the list, and you answered present and gave your place in the file. The quartermaster checked the lashing on the pack horse closest to your section and spoke the instruction to keep pace with the Lord's palanquin. You and Kenji walked to the inner gate and took your place by the banner that marked your unit, ready to move when the signal came. At first light, at the outer gate, the line formed under the stone, and the last lists were gathered by the clerk. The creak of the pack saddle set a gentle rhythm as the horse shifted and the ropes took their share. The banner with the Lord's crest stood ahead of you, and the spear tips of the guard showed where the front would start. The captain raised a hand, the flagman lifted his strip of cloth, and the order moved from file to file. Kenji leaned near and named the towns the train would pass before midday, a habit he kept from earlier marches. You fixed the laces on your sandals, placed your hand over the hilt in the usual way, and faced the road that pointed south. The palanquin waited behind the front rank, and the bearers stood with their poles braced against the ground in an even line. A pair of scribes held the chests of papers, and a cook pushed a handcart with bowls packed in straw for the midday stop. The steward cut the cord that had held the group at the gate, and the line began to move in the order set the night before. You counted steps to keep the pace, matched to Kenji's count, and kept the space between you and the standard-bearer steady. The road out of the castle town brought you past fields where winter work still showed in the stubble, and the farmers watched the train pass with simple bows. The captain called a halt by a marker stone, and the cook sent men down the line with wrapped rice balls and a jug of tea. You loosened the cord of your hat, took the rice with both hands, and split it with Kenji the way you had done on other marches. The salted plum at the center left a clear edge on your tongue, and the rice held together as it had been pressed. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered that the steward counted every wrapper and kept the pace fair. The steward passed again with the route slip and the seal impressions, and you put yours inside the fold of your sleeve where the pass also lay. Kenji bent to check the stitching on his sandal, and you fixed the strap with a small knot that would hold until the next halt. The armor laces sat in order under your traveling coat, and the rain cape stayed rolled at your belt in case the weather turned. The quartermaster made sure the spare sandals were spread along the files, and a groom checked the girth on the horse in your section. When the flagman gave the sign, you fell back into step and set your thoughts toward the first barrier station on the map. By mid-morning, the road narrowed between hills, and the line kept to pairs as you reached the barrier station where permits were shown. The guard at the gate took your pass, matched the seal to the list, and marked the register with a brush before sending you on without delay. The clerk asked after the number of porters and horses, and the scribe from your unit answered in the words agreed at the briefing. You crossed 2 small bridges, came to a ferry, and stood in order on the bank while the palanquin went over first. Kenji passed word from the rear that the horse loads would be shifted at the next rest, and you repeated it forward as trained. At noon, the captain chose a pine grove for the halt, and the men loosened cords, changed sandals, and checked the straps on their packs. You rubbed the grit under your heel with the needle kit, and set a fresh pad of paper in your sandal to steady the step. The cook gave out millet and dried fish, and the water carrier filled flasks while a groom fixed a broken strap with a spare length of cord. When clouds rose over the hills, the captain kept the pace and the line held together without hurry or complaint. By late day, you entered a post town, and the steward led the lord's party to the main inn, while your section took the stable yard and the rooms set aside for retainers. In the yard you unrolled bedding, hung the rain cape to air, and set your armor pieces where they would dry if needed after the next day's march. Kenji brought a bowl of miso and 2 wedges of radish from the cook, and you ate without rush while going over the next day's order. The quartermaster checked the stores, the scribe updated the route log, and the captain spoke the watch assignments in a steady tone. You sat with Kenji and patched the inside of a sandal with scrap paper, an old trick learned on a different road years before. The small clink of your fittings against the floorboards marked your careful movements as you set things away for the night. It may not have seemed important then, but it mattered that the old steps from the day before were in your hands now without thought. The early bough at the alcove, the wood in the yard, the brush on the page, and the line on the embankment each had its place in the roadwork. The second alarm at the river and the washing at the shrine had taken edge from your shoulders, and the hearth meal had taught your stomach to wait. The report you had written gave the steward what he needed, and it kept your mind clear for the movement expected in the capital. You and Kenji spoke of the barrier still ahead, the bridges to come, and the way the season would meet you when you reached the Shogun's city. Night came simple in the post town, and you stretched your legs, checked the cords once more, and lay with your pack within reach and your swords beside you. The straw pillow rustled when you settled your head, and the boards under you stayed solid after the long day of measured steps. Kenji lay just beyond your reach, and you knew he was going through the next day's turns as he usually did. You counted back through the morning's gate, the checks at the barrier, the stops for sandals, and the ferry that took the palanquin ahead. The duty had been plain, and it had kept every hand in the train working, from the groom at the girth to the scribe with the register. You knew the pattern of the Lord's will in the roadwork, and you found yourself steady in it without strain. The city ahead would ask for clean replies, straight shoulders, and shoes that left no mark where they should not, and you were ready to give that shape. You thought of the garden where the day had begun days before, and of the brush marks that had recorded the harvest, and the drills that had set your body to rhythm. These pieces stood together now, and they would carry you through the gate of the Shogun's city and back again when the season turned. You closed your eyes on that order, and in that calm you rested and let the road move you toward the next duty with the dawn. And so, our time among the samurai draws to a close. The swords return to their sheaths, the castles fade into the night, and the code of Bushido whispers its last. Until our next journey together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.